to optimize our organization as a whole with Maria Connor. Maria Connor is an agile coach in Workday. She's currently based at Workday in Dublin, Ireland, and she believes in the power of visualizing work, enabling teams to make value-driven decisions. Maria is passionate about applying systems thinking to our organizations and focusing improvement initiatives on improving the whole system. I'd like for you to be aware that you have the discussion forum panel and the live Q&A panel on the right-hand side of the portal. So please post your questions and comments throughout the session. We'll have a Q&A session afterwards, and I'll be taking your questions and comments from the live Q&A panel so we can discuss them. And please ensure that you place all your questions in the live Q&A panel. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Maria to begin the presentation. Maria, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that great introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. First of all, thanks everyone for coming along today. Hope you're enjoying the conference so far. Welcome to my very snappily titled talk, using Kanban to optimize our organization. Just a little bit about myself. So my name is Maria Connor. I've been working in the software industry for 20 years or so now. I started out as an engineer worked in waterfall teams, I've worked in Scrum teams, and I've worked in teams that were using Kanban. I've always been really interested in how we work as teams and process, and I've ended up being an agile coach, and I'm currently based in a company called Workday in Dublin, Ireland. Specifically, I work in an organization called Customer Deployment Tools, or CDT for short. It's worth noting that because I'll be referencing it a lot throughout the talk. In my career, look, I've spent a lot of time, as I said, in teams and coaching teams and talking a lot about team agility, right? And how do we effectively improve the workflow in a team? But if I really reflect on a lot of that time spent, to be honest, the impact, if I'm really honest with myself, the impact that sometimes it quite often ended up being that I had succeeded in helping a team to become more efficient at solving maybe not the right customer problems. For me, the realization I've kind of come to through experience is that a delivery team is really just part of an overall system. And it's more about how those teams actually work together in an organization to deliver customer value. It's the true system that, I want to kind of spend my time and effort in improving. And I'm not just talking about the delivery space, I'm talking about product, I'm talking about how organizations actually make decisions. How do we decide what customer problems to go after? How do we decide, or how do we know that we're actually solving those customer problems? To me, if we can create and put our effort into visualizing those systems and improving those systems, I think that's how we get to true business agility. And today I want to tell you the story of really why I have that perspective and the experiences that we went through in our organization to kind of lead us to that conclusion. So that's the story I'm going to tell today. Just before I start the story, I guess a little bit about us in Customer Deployment Tools. We are an organization of 90 people. We are based across 3 different locations in Dublin, Ireland, where I am, but also in the US in Salt Lake City and in Pleasanton. Our teams they're cross-functional. There's different skill sets within the team. So engineering, product, ops, design, all in one team. Our teams use Kanban to manage the flow of work at team level. But really for the story I'm going to tell today in terms of optimizing the whole organization, if you're thinking about it from your own perspective, your teams could be doing Kanban, they could be doing Scrum, or there could be teams that are just doing the work. It's not super relevant, which methodology the teams are actually using to manage their own work. Before I start the story at the beginning, I kind of wanted to start with where we actually ended up and where we are now. Look, we didn't really start out with any such grandiose notions as let's make our business agile and not our teams, right? We ended up here out of necessity because as we were scaling out, we kept bumping up against these problems that were more intangible, what problems are we actually solving and why? And we had no view of these things. And we kept finding that we had to kind of zoom out a level in the organization to start to look and validate some assumptions that we had and start to really see the problems in the organization because they weren't manifesting themselves at the team level. And now a lot of you might look at this and think, yeah, this looks like flight levels. And for sure, I think we've ended up in a space where it is very akin to that. But we didn't deliberately set out to try and adopt flight levels. We found Klaus's work actually as we were kind of a bit of the way through our journey, and it's brilliant work, and we've definitely adopted a lot of that, but we didn't set out kind of really with that intent, but it's certainly, I think, much like where we've ended up. And so I just want to tell you the story of kind of how and why we've ended up here. We started with what I would term as a pretty typical agile adoption across the teams. We started with one team. That team adopted the practices of Kanban. They started to look to improve their flow of work. They started to visualize the work, looking for bottlenecks. They applied WIP limits, and they created a pull system, and they started to see real gains in terms of efficiency of the flow of work. And then when I copy and paste here, I'm not trying to imply homogenizing teams or process. It's really more about, look, what was successful on one team, other teams adopted the practices of Kanban, and they saw success in that, and so on and so forth, until all 13 teams in the organization had actually adopted the practices of Kanban. But at that point, it should have been, right, well, cool, we're agile, we're done. But it certainly didn't feel like that. We certainly had a lot of problems in the organization, like I mentioned, that weren't necessarily manifesting themselves at the team level. I suppose to best describe it, we could more feel it. It felt like we weren't really getting a lot done as an organization. It felt like potentially we were overloaded. For us, some of the customer problem spaces that the teams were working in, teams were maybe taking on a piece of the problem space, and there could be 3 or 4 teams working on the same problem space. And yet, there was no way to really see where the problem space was as a whole. You had to kind of go and talk to 3 or 4 different teams and get 3 or 4 different answers. And I mentioned that teams were they were getting more efficient in the flow of work that was coming through the teams, but we started to ask, well, what is this work? What are the main problem spaces that the teams are working on? We didn't really have a view of that. So our conclusion was, look, I think we kind of need to zoom out a bit, and we need to look at the organization as a whole and start to see where are the problems in the organization and make those kind of intangible problems more tangible for ourselves. So this was our first very rudimentary view of the work across the organization. What we did was we just kind of went out to the teams and asked each of the teams individually, what are the main customer problem spaces that you're working on? What are the big ticket items that you're going after, features, epics, whatever your favorite term is. And we put them onto a board. It's kind of a proto Kanban system, I would say. There was a bit of a workflow, but what this really gave us was, look, now we could see what the team's kind of primary goals were, what were the problems that they were going after, and we could start to talk to them. Unfortunately, I kind of took this photo a few months into when we started to refine the system, but initially when we put this together, I'm talking about teams of 4 to 6 people, and some of these teams had 4, 6, 8, 10 problem spaces that they were working on. And our overwhelming sense of when we first looked at this view of the work in the organization was, yeah, look, no wonder we're not really getting things done. We're working on so much, right? The focus is so diluted. And we started to think to ourselves, well, look, the successes that the teams had in terms of applying those practices to their work, could we actually apply them to this? And could we evolve this to be more of a real Kanban system? And that's what we did. This is what we call the CDT Work in Progress board. This board is the view of the organization, like all 13 teams, this is the view of their work. So each one of these tickets represents a piece of the problem space that the teams are working on, or like I said, epic, feature, whatever your favorite term is. I'm not going to talk through this board in any great detail. Again, this is what was right for us in our context, but if you're interested, I'm more than happy to, share the boards and talk through them later on. But to give you a bit more context, like I said, the first thing that struck us was the amount of work in the organization, and that was definitely having an impact in terms of the amount of customer value we were actually releasing. We were so busy trying to do all these things, we weren't really getting much done. So our first aim was to try and reduce the amount of work in the organization. And some of the ways we did that, we encouraged the teams to really to look to try and focus on finishing things rather than starting new work. So where a team came free, rather than pulling in the next piece of work, actually going to see across the organization where there are opportunities there where they could help another team and look to help to finish something. The other thing that this board gave us, making this view that was previously intangible tangible, we could start to see where the dependencies in the organization were. So as we were observing the system, some of the teams, when they were trying to pull work through the system, they kept getting blocked or stopped on the same thing. Maybe they needed a particular skill set from another team that they didn't have, and they just kept getting blocked in the same places. And so that was a great opportunity for leadership in the organization to look to see, actually, can we reorganize some of these teams and distribute some of those skill sets and teams had more of a clean run in terms of being able to pull that work through and release the value to the customer. I talked about as well, look, the overwhelming kind of amount of work that was on the board initially. Like, this board didn't start out like this, right? It evolved to be this. But one of the things we introduced was the concept of rocks. Rocks for us in CDT are the most impactful customer pieces of work that we can do, you know, the most impactful customer problems that we can solve, or the things that we feel are really going to drive the organization forward. And simply just by visualizing what the rocks were, we now enable the teams to actually start to make trade-off towards those things, right? If the rocks are the most important things to move, the team started to trade off towards those and started to move them. We run a stand-up around this board every Tuesday in our organization. It's open to all 90 people. I took a screen grab just from this week as to what it currently looks like. Look, for us, it's probably just worth noting that we had to tackle the issue of remoteness early on, because we are a remote team. You know, we've teams here in Dublin and we've teams in the US, and you know, for us, we were kind of already set up to do that. So whilst it's been massively impactful in many other ways, you know, for this stuff, we were already kind of set up to do that. So from that initial stage of just creating that view of work in the organization, we were actually able to see and validate some of those assumptions as to, look, we were working on too much. We had lots of dependencies. We could now see these things. And I just wanted to highlight the last point here. Up until the point where we created that view of work in the organization, a lot of our teams were quite siloed. They were, they had no view of what else was going on in the organization, right? They were kind of focused on their own mission, their own work. And now we had created this view where teams could see what was going on in the organization and knew what other teams were working on, and really presented those opportunities in a forum for the teams to now go and, you know, if they could take help on something, to really put that ask out for help, or equally, if you were a team that could offer help, there was a forum to now go and offer help to others. So again, you know, by doing that, we started to create more focus, and we started to see more of these things move, and we were able to release more customer value. I'm going to talk a lot about the mistakes we made along the way, and this was a big one. I think in our enthusiasm to get, you know, running with that new system and that new view of work across the organization, we actually left a lot of people behind. I'm talking a lot about systems, and you know, the systems are not the tool, the systems not the board, it's the people working together to deliver value. And I think although we thought we'd been clear on the intent, it was obvious that people were confused, right? People, it particularly manifested itself, I think, in the stand-ups, where people just didn't really understand what we were trying to achieve, you know, and you could see that people found it kind of difficult to move through that workflow because they didn't necessarily understand the workflow. And it was obvious that we had sort of reached a point of complete misalignment. So what we did is a couple of things. One of the things we did is we did an offsite, and we took the leadership out for an offsite where leadership across engineering, product, design, architecture, and we were trying to just get back to basics and align on what is the intent of creating this system and creating this view of work. Really what we're trying to do is optimize the flow of value to the customer. And we'd also, you know, we'd created this view of the organization, but we'd forgotten some basics of, you know, Kanban and some of the practices where, to be really explicit about how this workflow, you know, how work moves through this workflow, we hadn't created policies, and we needed to go back and do that. I think it's very, very difficult to, or kind of impossible to improve something if you're not all on the same page to begin with, you know, if you're all not looking at the same thing. And that's what we were trying to do. Sometimes it could be quite subjective in terms of, I have an experience of, I think I know how we work as an organization, another person has a different point of view on that. And it was to try and align on that and be very explicit about those policies and how work should move through the system. It's infamous in CDT, we called it the policy party. Don't think anyone wants to come to a party that I throw ever again, but it was quite necessary, right? Because we've become so misaligned, we had to get back to that point of alignment. In my experience of looking at and trying to optimize an organization as a whole and sort of look at an organization as a whole, you really absolutely need senior leadership buy-in to do that. You can't get anywhere without that. But equally, you have to bring the teams along with you, right? The teams are the ones doing the work. And look, in a team of 90 or an organization of 90 people, I know that not everyone is necessarily going to want to drive these things forward or be even interested in this kind of stuff, but there are always people who are, and we went out and found those people who are interested in process and ways of working, and interested in looking at this stuff, and people from all different disciplines, all different levels of experience, and they call themselves the process advocates. And really what their role is to champion, that notion of being part of a larger team, being part of a larger organization, and looking at the system as a whole. And look, these guys are all experienced in Kanban because they've used it on their own teams. And another big part of their role is to help, coach leadership on some of this stuff, and the things that, the practices that worked well in their team, or some of the experiments that worked well in their team, could they also work on this larger system? And I think as well, just having a forum where they could tell each other stories, and share experiences with each other. So with that kind of leadership alignment, and with the buy-in from the teams, to be honest, this is months and months and months in, we were kind of at a point now where we were like, right, we can actually finally start. And one thing we were quite conscious of is we didn't want to get to that point of misalignment again, right? Because all 90 people make up the system, all 90 people have a stake in this, and no one person should be able to change that system. We have to collectively change it together. So we created this forum. It's monthly ops review, and what it is anybody in the organization can come and really talk to any observations they have about the system, and problems that they might have seen in the system, and present a hypothesis for maybe a change to make to the system, and what potential impact that change could have. And we discuss it collectively, and then we agree whether to adopt that change or not. You might be thinking, right, how on earth do you make decisions across a group of 90 people? That's an absolutely fair question. And look, it is difficult, but we've tried lots of different things and failed at some of them. But one of the things that's actually worked really well for us is there's a model called generative decision making by Samantha Slade, and that's something that we've adopted in this forum, and it's really helped us to any of those kind of forums where you're trying to make decisions across a large group of people. It's a very useful framework. Look, some of these things are blindingly obvious, but I think it's worth stating them because we made these mistakes. And I think for anybody out there who's embarking on a similar journey or in the middle of it, it's worth calling out if we can help people not to make some of the same mistakes we did. So the first one, again, just people are the change. And I think especially as a leader, you can't state or overstate your intent enough. You have to bring people along with you, and you have to invest and be very deliberate about change management. And the second one, again, just, don't forget the obvious things, don't forget the practices. Again, that thing of making sure everyone's on the same page to begin with before you try to evolve anything, right? Be very explicit about, if you're creating a system like this, defining that workflow and being explicit about it. But on the flip side of it, look, we were aligned. We did start to get this notion of being, a large team, an organization that's working together, and we started to see work moving and teams helping each other out and kind of trading off towards the rocks. But as we continued to observe the system, as we were looking at these, features or pieces of work flowing through the system, we start to ask ourselves, well, look, what is this problem space we're going after? Why are we choosing to work on this particular thing and not that particular thing? What's the customer value this thing is providing? I think fundamentally what we were asking ourselves is, how do we make decisions as an organization? For us, one of the other observations was that some work was actually taking a really long time to move through the system. And it felt like things had a bit of a long tail, and it felt like, potentially teams were investing more in a particular problem space because they could, not necessarily because they should. And on the other end of it, then we developed, I think, a bad habit of, we would celebrate when things moved to done, and we would clap because something had moved into production, and then the team would go and look to help another team or take on new work. But that thing that had gone to production, we weren't validating, well, hang on, did that have a customer impact? Did it solve a customer problem? How do we know? And do we need to do more in that space? So we felt like, look, there's more to this. There's more of an upstream piece, I think, in terms of how we make decisions as an organization and how we validate some of our assumptions about what we're building. So we decided to try and make that tangible, because again, it was intangible, and map that out. So we did a workshop to define that flow, and we were smarter this time. We actually did define the policies for how we move work through that flow. And this is what we've ended up with. So again, zooming out another level, what this system really reflects is how we make decisions as an organization. So starting from the very left-hand side, like when we have identified a customer problem, we need to ask ourselves, do we have data to show that this is a good problem space to go after? And then at every stage after that, as we continue to move along the workflow, we have to continue to ask that question. Do we still want to invest in this space? Like, do we have the data to show that this is actually a good customer problem to go after, and show that data to each other, pitch it out to the organization. Also, we wanted to do more validation about, look, when we're taking on a problem space, what's our hypothesis? What needle are we trying to move for the customer? What impact do we expect to have? And do we have a measure for that? Can we measure it? And that became part of the definition of done for the teams as well, to build that capability to measure the impact as well. If it didn't exist, we had to build it so that we could measure whether we were having the right impact for our customers. So then over on the very right-hand side here, in terms of launch and validation, some of the policies around exiting out of that were, look, when something goes to production, after a couple of days, we should be able to tell, is anyone using it? Because there's no better assessment of impact. If no one's using it, there's clearly been no customer impact. After a couple of weeks, we should be able to tell who's using it and how much. And then after a couple of months, we should be able to really draw a line in and say, well, have we actually been successful in this, right? Have we moved the needle in the way that we want to move it, or is there more to do in this space? But again, it's about making really conscious, deliberate decisions about this, like declaring, yes, we think we've had that, there's success in this space, or no, there's more to do. I mentioned at the beginning how I felt as a coach that, look, I spent so much of my time talking to team efficiencies and team workflows, but, if you're not really answering these two questions, I think potentially a lot of that can be wasted effort, because you're not looking at the right customer problems, or teams are not validating that they're actually solving those customer problems. So for me, going into a new organization, I think these are the two questions I would start with in terms of trying to get those answers. Are we working on the most important customer problems, and what's the data to show us, that we are? And equally, those things that we're doing, are they having an impact, and what's the data that actually shows us that? So that's, I would really encourage everybody, like in an organization, these are the things that we should start with, because if we can't answer these things, I think everything else is just suboptimal to try and spend our time in those spaces. So this is where we've ended up, right? Like from zooming out right up to customer ideation, how do we choose what to work on? How do we make decisions as an organization, down to how is that work then, spread across the teams, and what does that delivery flow look like? And then down at the team level, the team breaks that work down and manages it on their own boards. I certainly wouldn't imply that we've ended up in some sort of problem-free state. I don't think that's possible. I think it's more about choosing the problems that you want to have. And look, this stuff to me is like, you peel away the layer of the onion, and then there's more, you uncover more and more problems as you start to zoom out. But I think they're more fundamental problems that are worth solving. I think, the higher the level you go, I think the bigger the impact that you will have in terms of addressing or solving some of the problems that you see. In terms of where we're at now and what's next, I mentioned the rocks, and the rocks for us are kind of like larger programs of work. And again, we don't really necessarily have great visibility in terms of, well, what are we trying to achieve with each of these rocks? What's actually left in them? And I think we're talking about trying to zoom out again and creating a view of that. So probably more to come in that space. Those of you listening, hopefully you still are. Anybody who's thinking about, look, I'm keenly aware that we're not the only people thinking about these problems or trying to tackle these problems. I think they're kind of age-old problems. But thinking about, for us in CDT, it kind of just coughed and spluttered to life. We kept moving up because we had to, out of necessity, and we were trying to make these things tangible. But we weren't necessarily following any particular framework or anything like that. The way I kind of think about it is, if I was going into another organization, how would I look to approach it? And this is sort of how I think about it, and it might be useful to anybody who's thinking about embarking on something similar. Starting at the beginning, just to simply visualize the work that's there in the organization. So something like going to each of the teams and asking them, what are the customer problem spaces that you're working on, and build that view up. And it's really important the lens that you apply to this, because I'm not advocating for going to every team and grabbing every story and mashing it all onto one board. I don't think you get much value out of that. I think the more you can zoom out in that view, the better, the better decisions, the better more fundamental problems I think you'll end up seeing. And, you know, for me, if we can zoom out right to the level of how do we actually make decisions as an organization and visualize that, I think that's where you get the biggest opportunity to improve. Secondly, I'd say once you create that view, agree a forum where you can actually talk to what you're seeing and looking and really analyzing that organization as a whole. I've called it a stand-up a few times, but I think stand-up comes with a lot of connotations, and I've seen these things devolve quite quickly into status updates, you know, especially if you're not clear with the intent starting out. People can feel like, oh, what is this forum I'm going in and I have to talk to the work, and I think really try and keep the conversation in these forums focused to what you really care about, right? What you really want to talk to. It's looking at the system as a whole, trying to get people to talk to even how they feel when they look at the system. You're trying to talk to managing that flow of customer value. So for us, you know, the best way to not have it be a status update is just, you know, don't let it be like, be very deliberate about the questions that you want people to answer in that forum. We talk a lot to, you know, is it blocked? Because if we're talking about the flow of value, like the most important thing is it not flowing, right? Is it blocked, or are we stopped for some reason? Do we need help on anything? Can we offer help on anything? And then everything else is, you know, we don't need to talk about each piece in great detail. If there's a team coming in and the work is flowing fine and they don't need anything, that a thumbs up is good enough, right? We don't need to do a deep dive into everything and talk about what we've done for the last 2 weeks. The next step I would say is, look, in my experience, inevitably there's going to be a lot of work in the organization. I've yet to be in an organization where we did this and it wasn't an overwhelming amount of work. And I think trying to agree, look, in all of this, what are the most important customer problems, and actually visualize that. I think it's a very powerful thing to do that, because once you do that, you're giving the teams information and saying, look, these are the things we care most about moving, like these are the things that are most impactful. And teams are making trade-offs every day, right, as to what to take on. And they'll start, you know, give them the information and they'll use it. They'll start trading off towards those things. And you don't need to, as a leader, run around and try and micromanage teams. I think, you know, you give them the information and they'll use it. And then lastly, I think again, the systems, that the board is just a board. Like if you create a board and if you work in your organization, nothing's going to change unless you have people who are willing to see it and talk to the problems that they see and share their observations and share their ideas for how to improve that system. And so you definitely need a forum for that. I would say, look, just kind of anecdotally, this is not a couple of weeks work, right? I'd say each of these stages is months and months, you know, to try and to build a system, to get comfortable with it, to start to talk to it, to align on what those important problems are. You know, you need data for that. So like, this isn't something that I think is you do quite quickly. I'm probably hammering some of these points home at this stage, but look, again, really think about going into an organization where can you have the biggest impact, particularly for me as a coach. And I think it's about trying to get answers to those questions in terms of how do we make decisions? How do we decide what customer problems to work on? The second point, again, just like you have to bring people along with you, especially for leadership. Again, be very deliberate about change management and about setting out your intent and bringing people along with you. And then on the last point, look, there's no prescriptive way to do this. I know there's lots of other smart people out there who are looking at these problems and trying to solve these problems, and there's loads of different scaling frameworks out there too. But for us, like every context, I know a few speakers have mentioned this in the last couple of days, but like context is really important, right? And I think it's okay to take and borrow bits of different things. You know, we've ended up with an amalgamation of different methodologies, different frameworks. There's no one thing, there's no one right way. I think you just have to try, find what's right for you, and you know, be willing to fail and make mistakes and then move on from it, you know. So it's okay not to think that there's no single framework out there that I think that's going to help you. I think you just have to be curious and try a few different things. I put this in for anyone who needs to hear it, because I know I would have liked to have heard it at some points. It is really hard to make significant change. And I think particularly when you're talking about answering these questions, like, you know, how do we make decisions as an organization, and how do we know if we're actually building the right things and having an impact? And sometimes it can be really tempting when you're in the mire of it all to go, oh, let's just go back to the old way of doing things, you know. And I certainly felt like that at points. It's like, just it's too hard, let's just go back to the old way. But really, I think when you're in that kind of painful state, that's it's the cost of trying to do something new, right? It's the cost of like jumping to that new curve. And I think you need to push through it because the spoils are on the other side. So just wanted to put that in for anyone who needs to hear it. As painful or as difficult as it can be, I think, you also don't need to be a martyr about it. There's definitely help out there. And like I said, there's lots of really smart people out there that are thinking about these problems too. And for us in CDT, whether they know it or not, these are the people that actually really ended up helping us the most. Klaus Leopold, so again, a few people have done talks on flight levels. We certainly took a lot from his work, and I went on his enterprise Kanban coaching course. And then Jose and JP from Actinio Consulting, all of our delivery leads and our advocates, most of our advocates actually went on their KMP training course. And look, I think what these guys have in common is I've mentioned, you need to do what's right in your context. They're very keenly aware of that. They're not trying to just farm out easy answers for you. That they don't at all. They really encourage you, highly encourage you to think for yourself. But I think what they really give you as well is just a lot of questions, right? Like, you come away, I know I came away just thinking so much about these things and these problem spaces in a different way that really helped me to understand for my own context how I could look to tackle these things. Because sometimes, especially if you're in that really, that place where it feels really difficult and you want to get out of it, I think it's worth taking a few days out and just like talking to other people, get off your island, get out of your silo, talk to other people and what's going on. And I think that's kind of to my final point. I think that's the large part of why we come to these things, right? Is we're here to tell each other stories and to share experiences, and we're just humans who are trying to learn from each other. And I'm hoping by telling my story today that it helps some people, but equally, I'm here to learn from everybody else. And like I said, I know that we're not the only people kind of looking at this stuff, and I'd love to hear your stories. I'd love to hear your experiences. So I'm around for the rest of the day if anyone wants to reach out and tell me a bit of their story or wants to hear more about our story. I think that's actually me. So I think we could take questions now if there's time.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, Maria. Appreciate it. And we do have quite a few questions that we'll go over. We'll start out with Catherine. She actually was the first one to come up with some questions. The first question is, and it's actually a two-part question, is how would you introduce this to a large team where some members do not know Kanban or Agile? And then the second part is, how would you suggest we introduce it?
Cool. Yeah, on the first part, I actually have experience of this because, look, the organization I originally worked in, they actually had a lot of experience of Kanban, but going into an organization that doesn't, or doesn't really necessarily follow any sort of agile methodology, I think you can do, I kind of call it stealth Kanban, but look, just starting with simply visualizing the work, right? You don't need to go in and talk to people, particularly, I think, to be honest, with some senior leaders, there's no faster way to make them roll their eyes and switch off than going in and talking to Kanban and Kanban practices. I think, you can talk to, let's just start with simply visualizing what's there, make it tangible. The work that's there, just simply visualizing that, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied back to any sort of agile practices. It's just like, let's just visualize it and let's start to talk to it. So that's one thing. And then I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
The second part was, how would you suggest we introduce it?
So yeah, again, I think just the steps that I lined out there in terms of like that first point of just visualizing the work. Secondly, getting people to talking to what they see. And then thirdly, trying to align on, look, in all of this, what are the most important problems? I think that alignment piece is really key. If you can get people talking to, look, can we agree? What are the most important customer problems we're looking to go after? That's a really good starting point. And look, thereafter, you can apply all of those good practices. You can introduce those concepts in Agile around, refining the workflow and improving the workflow. But I think just starting with that alignment of what are the customer problems we really want to solve for is probably a good space.
Great, thank you. Now, another question that was asked by several people is your deck going to be available after this conference?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, awesome, great. Because there were some people that had some questions. You listed some questions on a slide and they didn't have enough time to capture. So I know the recording's going to be available, but also the deck. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Carmack asks, could you tell us a bit about the process that you use to identify the right rocks?
Yeah, that's a good one, right? Because I mentioned that one of those two questions was, how do we know that we're working on the most important customer problems? And when you ask that question, it seems like a really easy question to ask. But again, it's quite subjective, right? And in some organizations, it can be, look, it's the loudest voice. It's the, there's lots of different reasons why organizations choose to go after certain customer problems. But I think for me, you have to pair it back to the data, right? What is the data that you have? And if you don't have the data, you need to go and get that data. So I think in terms of understanding what our rocks were, it was really trying to get a view of the customer landscape and seeing, this is probably a whole other talk, but I think it's, really, what are the customers' needs? What's the data to prove out those needs? And Melissa, actually, she talked a lot about it in her talk yesterday, but really getting feedback from the customer, understanding their needs, but also not just taking what they say, using quantitative data as well, like in terms of their usage, their, really data, I think, is key to that conversation. It's not about people's opinions, it's about the data that should drive that conversation. So I could neatly summarize it, I would say, yeah, just let the data drive the conversation, not people's opinions.
Okay, great. Shane's question is, what challenges did you face with getting leadership and the product side of the org to buy into reducing the amount of work in progress, and how did you overcome these?
Look, because to be brutally honest, I actually was quite lucky in terms of I had the delivery lead and the product manager. They're actually pretty, like, they understood the concept of, look, we can't do everything, right? And the more we try and do, the less we're going to get done. So it wasn't really that much of an uphill struggle to try to actually try to get that buy-in. But certainly going into other organizations, it's not always the case. And again, I think it's about trying to prove it out and using data to support that. So I'm not going to talk to over egg the concept of WIP here, but again, it really is that about what's the most important things to be working on, what do we care about moving the most, and putting our focus to that. And then, look, there's a lot of metrics that we use then to back that up, but I think in terms of how to kind of prove it out, it's really, look, when we do reduce down the amount of work in the system, we get more done. Trying to kind of convince people of that up front. Honestly, in my experience, where as a coach, if I'm talking to somebody about these concepts and kind of having a conversation, particularly with leaders, where they sort of show no interest and they're like, look, you just go and do your agile thing and I'll be over here and let me know when it's done. I'm not really interested in working with leaders like that. I mean, if a leader doesn't fundamentally see that they are overwhelmed or that there's just too much work going on in the organization, I don't know that there's very much that you as a coach particularly can do that will convince them otherwise.
Okay, great. We got about 2 minutes left and we got about 5 or 6 more questions. So Korkut asks, is your implementation of boards at different levels are actually inspired from flight levels? I joined a bit late and maybe I missed that part.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I think, look, I pointed out, we didn't really start out with any sort of intent, right? We just knew that there were some intangible problems that we wanted to make tangible and we wanted to sort of visualize what was going on in the organization. But when we started to look outside of, what was going on in the industry, like, again, like, these are not uncommon problems. And we saw and we found Klaus's work, and that really, really helped us to shape it. So I think ultimately we have implemented, I'm always cautious because I don't know if Klaus would agree, but I think we've ended up with some sort of model of flight levels in the organization for sure. And his teachings and his books and everything really, really helped us as an organization.
Okay, great. Thank you. Aiden asked, are the infrastructure teams involved in this process? And also, are these teams using the Kanban within Workday?
So yeah, like in our organization, as I mentioned, it's kind of, we have ops, engineers, product, architecture, all kind of in the one group. But outside of that, we obviously have dependencies, because I mentioned some of the dependencies in the organization. We obviously have dependencies outside, Workday is a large organization, and we definitely do have dependencies on infrastructure teams. At the moment, we are kind of, that system that I showed is really based on our organization, but I don't see any reason why you couldn't scale that out and actually start to, like, if anything, the more and more you zoom out across the organizations, you'll start to see those dependencies. So those dependencies become not team to team, but organization to organization. So in answer to your question, I would love to do that in terms of zooming out a bit more and actually start to model some of those dependencies, because for sure, that definitely is. I just think it's another lens we could zoom out a bit further and start to look to see what are some of those bottlenecks, or what are some of the dependencies that exist even across Workday, not just in a single organization.
Okay, and we have run out of time. However, Maria, I understand you're going to come back, and those questions we didn't get to, you're going to answer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll do my best to, because I think the questions actually stay here. So
Yeah,
I'll jump
they
in
do.
and I can reach out to people individually, or just type the answers in, actually, if it's probably more useful.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So check back, and I'm sure she'll have have all there's 4 questions remaining. She'll have them answered before the end of the conference. Thank you all very much. Maria, thank you. Awesome job.
No,
Have a great day.
thanks for your help as
Yep.
well. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks. Bye-bye.